What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in our video today for April Fool's Day, I figured what better character to talk about than the Clown Prince of Crime? None other than the Joker himself. Now, what's going to be really cool about this video is that we're actually going to be able to look at the Joker's continuity, look at his history in DC Comics, and in fact, trace the popularity, the rise to prominence of Batman comics, as well as this sort of lull period, and then this reemergence of Batman's popularity by simply just looking at the Joker, because the Joker is a key figure in the success of Batman's continuity. Now, one of the things that we know, I guess one of the more common aspects of the Joker's history, is that he had appeared in Batman issue number 1 in 1940. Now, he was created by Bob Kane, Bill Finger, and Jerry Robinson, but there's some contesting as to who it was that had actually created who and who it was that had actually been involved in the creation of the Joker. But what we know is that in some capacity, these three men were involved. Now, what they were looking for, what DC was looking for, was a way to basically challenge Batman in a way that had never been seen before. They wanted to introduce some kind of a villain that was far beyond anything that we had seen, because keep in mind, in the golden age of comics, a lot of the villains that we saw were simply a reflection of the time. They were villains who were thugs, they were criminals, they were, I guess maybe bank robbers and things like that. They weren't really anything that was pushing the envelope. They wanted to do this with the Joker. They wanted to introduce a villain that would test Batman both mentally as well as emotionally, somebody that would push him to his limits. And so with the initial introduction of the Joker in Batman issue number 1, we saw this playing out. What happens here is that we actually join a couple who are listening to a radio broadcast, and the radio broadcast is interrupted by some man who basically says that at midnight he's going to kill a man by the name of Henry Claridge, who's actually the mayor of Gotham. And so what happens is, of course, the police respond to this threat, so on and so forth, but when midnight strikes, Henry Claridge dies. And when he dies, he actually ends up dying with this grin on his face. And what the police do is they begin investigating the crime scene. They begin looking around and trying to figure out what all had happened here. And what they do is they stumble across the safe of Henry Claridge, and they find what they believe to be the diamond that Henry Claridge had owned. But in reality, the diamond is a fake. It was replaced with a glass replica, and under this diamond is a card of the Joker. It's a Joker playing card. And so what we do is we realize that the Joker seems to be the one that's actually done this. And so we switch to the Joker himself as he's basically mulling over what's happened so far. And what the Joker does is he tells us how it was that he had killed Henry Claridge. What he says is that he had injected Henry Claridge with a time toxin 12 hours before he made his declaration of killing him, so that when midnight struck on the night that he was supposed to kill Henry Claridge, that Henry Claridge would in fact drop dead because the toxin took 24 hours to take effect. And so what the Joker had done is he had injected Henry Claridge, and then he had taken the diamond, so that anybody who watched Henry Claridge, anybody who was with him at the time, would think there was some kind of superstition here. Now, the next person that he claims to kill is a man named Jay Wilde. And what the Joker does here is he effectively uses a different scheme each time he kills a person. When he goes after Jay Wilde, he's actually in a suit of armor. When he makes his declaration, when he makes his threat in saying he will kill Jay Wilde and then he'll take the rubies of Jay Wilde, the police, of course, respond to this. And when the police respond, we find that what the Joker does is he basically begins to, I guess, bombard them with some kind of toxin, with some kind of gas. And the result is that the police are knocked unconscious and Jay Wilde is again killed. And so he takes the rubies of Jay Wilde and then he leaves. And so the third person that he threatens is the judge, is a person named Judge Drake. And what happens with Judge Drake is that that the Joker pretends to be the chief of police and then basically says he's going to be protecting Judge Drake. And so what Judge Drake realizes is that this is in fact the Joker. And so what the Joker does is then again kill Judge Drake. Now, the whole reason why Judge Drake is killed by the Joker is because the Joker states that Judge Drake had previously locked him up. And so we won't actually find out until a little while from now why it was this had happened, like what it was the Joker was referring to in this particular instance. But the fact remains that this basically catches the attention of Batman and Dick Grayson, because again, Dick Grayson was Robin at this particular point in time in the golden age of comics. And so what we do is we pick up with Batman and Robin as they're trying to track down the Joker, as they're chasing down the Joker. Joker. They eventually locate him and they capture him in the signature scene in this final comic when the Joker's basically hanging by the edge of a building and Batman pulls him up and then takes him to jail. Now, following the initial introduction of the Joker and going forward into the golden age of comics, the Joker basically became a mainstay in Batman for about the first 12 or 13 issues or so. And the reason why was because the Joker was extremely well received by fans. Fans loved this idea of a person who dressed up as a clown and who put Batman to the test, who basically made Batman go through all the rigors of trying to find a way to capture this person. But at the same time, it was a break away from the monotony of what we'd seen with so many different superheroes up to this point. By this point in the golden age, we had Batman, we had Name of the Submariner from Marvel Comics, we had other characters who were coming along and who were basically, I guess, fighting their own villains. Of course, with Superman, different things like that. And so for Batman to be among this group, but to have a villain that stood out in and of himself, this was a great way for fans to be pulled in. And so what we basically found here was that DC was hitting all the right notes. We had Dick Grayson as Robin, who was able to identify with younger kids. We had the Joker, who was able to identify with people who wanted something different than what they'd seen so far. And so what we found was that in 1951, I think, with Detective Comics issue number 168, that Bill Finger gives us the origin of the Joker. And what he tells us here is that in this story, which is basically kind of I guess a crime instruction, so to speak, by Batman. That is to say, he's been brought before a class for criminology, and he's teaching them the steps of how to basically decipher crime scenes. He recounts the story of the Red Hood, and what he tells them is that the Red Hood was the villain that he never caught. He never found out who the Red Hood was, and he was never able to capture the Red Hood in any form or fashion. And what he tells us is that the Red Hood apparently was a criminal who had undergone the process of committing various robberies and sorts for the goal of basically collecting $1 million and then retiring from the criminal scene. And so as a result, Batman had chased him down, he had tracked him down multiple times, but had never quite caught him. And so over the course of this story, what actually is revealed to us is that the Red Hood returns as a result of Batman's actions. And so because of this, Batman, I guess, reignites his investigation into the Red Hood, and ultimately it's revealed to us that the Red Hood is the Joker. And what Joker tells us in this story is that when he and Batman had met each other at the Ace Chemical plant, that he had use his helmet as a way to basically breathe underwater, to make it possible for him to escape without having to worry about drowning. And when he had jumped into the chemical vat, that he had swam to safety and gone back home. But when he took off his helmet, he had realized that his face was bleach white, his lips were red, and that his hair was green. And so his argument here was that he could use this new mask to basically terrify people, to find a way to basically make them horrified at his very presence, and to also commit crimes. And so that led to the Joker to his current point in time. Now, a lot of people who are more traditionalists about the origin of Joker will cite this origin story, but most people will cite the origin story, which we'll get into, and of course we've already done a video on that, the video of the, the story of the Killing Joke. But nonetheless, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Now, what we know is that going forward, with the whole Batman continuity and the whole Joker introduction of into the Batman story, that again, the Joker was one of the very few villains in Batman continuity that lasted through the Golden Age. And the reason why I say this is because for those of you guys who have seen a lot of our videos where we've talked about the history of Marvel and DC Comics, we've talked about the Golden Age versus the Silver Age and characters coming about and different things like that. When the Golden Age began to wrap up around the mid-1950s, comic books began to take a turn towards science fiction, romance, different things like that, and very few superheroes or supervillains actually made the cut and remained as part of the continuity of comic books going past the Silver Age. The Joker was one of these characters that survived, but the problem was this. By 1954, things were starting to change. Things were starting to move in a different direction. And so what we found was that in that year, in 1954, a man by the name of Frederick Wortham, I believe, had published a book called Seduction of the Innocents. And what he said here was that the problem with comic books, with all these different forms of media, television, and so on that are cropping up, is that children are more influenced now than they ever were before, and that things like comic books, violence, and so on and so forth are impacting children in a way to where it leads to what he perceived to be negative actions, that is to say homosexuality and different things like that. Now, of course, we know now that this was really more of a baseless claim and that it's really a lot of nonsense, but the fact remains that at the time, this was extremely effective. And so again, in that same year, in 1954, we saw the introduction of the Comics Code Authority. And what the Comics Code Authority did is it basically went through comic book publications as a whole and said anything that contains any kind of violence, any kind of murder, any kind of, I guess, sexual activity, this is to say anything beyond the realm of light kissing and hand-holding, is forbidden. That any criminals that exist in comic books have to receive some kind of punishment as a result of their actions when the comic book comes to an end or when the story ends. And so basically we saw that the Joker was kind of swept under the rug, that this Bill Finger, this Bob Kane version of the Joker took a back seat, that he was no longer this sadistic and I guess very murderous kind of villain we had seen in the early days of his introduction, and instead he became this very goofy character, this very sort of silly character, I guess, with regards to why he did the kind of things that he did. Now, this was further impacted in 1964, and the reason why I say in 1964 is because at this point, Julius Schwartz had become the editor-in-chief of DC Comics, and Julius Schwartz did not like the idea of the Joker at all. Now, I haven't been able to deduce why it is, or I guess be able to find out why it is Julius Schwartz didn't like the Joker, but the fact remains that because Julius Schwartz, as the editor-in-chief, despised the Joker, what little remnants of the Joker there currently were in DC Comics began to fade away even more. And so the Joker was almost non-existent in DC Comics. And this is where I say we can basically trace the popularity and the decline in popularity of Batman comics. With the Joker's initial introduction and with Dick Grayson, it was very difficult to tell who it was that was really leading the popularity in Batman comics. It was difficult to tell if it was the Joker, if it was Batman, if it was Robin. We didn't really know who it was that was leading the popularity. But when the Joker had moved away from his sadistic roots and he had become very tamed down, kind of this comedic, nonsensical villain, Batman sales began to decline. And because they began to decline, it became very evident who it was that was leading the popularity of the Batman comics. But this really didn't do a whole lot to deter Julius Schwartz from bringing, I guess, from keeping the Joker away. And so what we found was that in 1966, with the TV show Batman, and with Cesar Romero playing the role of the Joker, where the comedic version of the Joker had basically taken a back seat and been almost non-existent, the character of the Joker was made up for with Cesar Romero playing his role. And so what we found was that continuing forward into DC Comics, that while the sales of Batman didn't really, I guess, increase, that the character of the Joker still stayed relevant. People still remembered who he was. And so what we found was that in, I guess, about 1973 or so, that Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams had basically been tasked with the idea of bringing the Joker back, of revitalizing the character of the Joker. And the way they had done this was by, I guess, effectively looking at the history of the Joker, by looking at Bill Finger and Bob Kane, by looking at the nonsensical Joker we got during the age of the comic book code authority. And so what they did is they combined the two elements. They said, okay, let's take this sadistic, murderous Joker and let's combine him with the funny Joker. And let's just have this guy who's very funny, but very dangerous at the same time. And I cannot begin to tell you how well received this was. I cannot begin to tell you. It was absolutely nuts how many fans loved this, because what we found here was that fans now had their old Joker back. They had the Joker they always loved, the Joker that would murder arbitrarily, the Joker that would kill people, the Joker that had these insane schemes in his head. But the other half was that they got laughter out of it. They got humor out of it. It was funny to watch this back and forth between the Joker and Batman. In addition to Neil Adams and Dennis O'Neil, what we found was that in 1976 or so, that Steve Englehart had taken over the role of writing for the writing for the Joker. And so what he did was in Detective Comics issues number 471 through 476, I think, that he created what many consider to be the quintessential Joker. Those of you guys who watched Batman the Animated Series, those of you guys who remember that version of the Joker, that's Steve Englehart Joker. That's the Joker who was incredibly insane and had insane schemes. And in fact, in Detective Comics issue number 475, I believe it was, Batman had actually made the statement and saying that the Joker's insane schemes make sense to no one but himself. And this single phrase, this one phrase, defines the Joker better than any story ever could. The reason being because during Steve Englehart's run, we got stories like The Laughing Fish. The Laughing Fish was quite literally a story whereby the Joker had given Fish his signature Joker expression, the signature grin as a result of the Joker toxin. And he wanted to copyright those fish. And that's how he was going to make make his money. That was the scheme of the Joker. That was his goal there. These stories, these, I guess, definitive attributes of the Joker are actually what would go on to define who the Joker would be, even now with the New 52 version of the Joker. But the fact remains that by 1988, DC began to realize that while the sales of Batman were starting to kind of break even, while they were starting to sort of, I guess, reach this plateau where they weren't really dipping down any further, they had to do something. They had to do something to revitalize interest in both the Joker and the Batman stories overall. And so what we found here was that DC had come along and DC had introduced to us the origin story of the Joker in Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. Now, Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, which is a series that we've already discussed, a couple of videos that we've already talked about so far, are a couple, or I guess is a series whereby we learn the entire history of the Joker, at least as it's given to us by Alan Moore. And this is the, I guess, the origin story that a lot of Joker fans really point to as the quintessential origin story, the defining element origin story of who it is the Joker is and why it is that he does the kind of things that he does. But the fact remains here that with this version of the Joker, with this origin story, it's not concrete. That even the Joker during the story itself says that sometimes he remembers his history one way and sometimes he remembers it another way. And because he's the one that's narrating the story and telling it to us, he's not reliable. And so DC was basically coming out and saying that this is not a solid story for the Joker. This is simply just an origin story and kind of an Elseworlds imprint, but that ultimately it was rolled back into the fold of DC main continuity. But the other thing DC did is they continued to look at the idea of the Joker and they said, we need to do more. We need to do something that's going to basically tell Joker fans that we're never going back to the Comics Code version of the Joker. We're never going back to the nonsensical, whimsical version of the Joker. We're going back to a serious, really sadistic, and a little comedic version of the Joker. And so what we found in the same year was that DC launched A Death in the Family. And A Death in the Family was a huge story, not just because it involved the death of Jason Todd, which was voted on by fans, but because it forever changed the standard of the Joker. In The Killing Joke, we found that the Joker had shot Barbara Gordon. That was the extent of his involvement in attacking and hurting members of the Bat family. That was as far as it had gotten. In A Death in the Family, he had killed Robin. He killed Jason Todd, and that was so big, it was so huge, because what DC had basically done is they had said, this is the line. This right here is the line. This is the road that we've crossed. We're never going back. Things are never going to be the same for the Joker. And we saw that playing out in the Joker's continuity from that point going forward. The Joker remained sadistic. The Joker remained comedic. The Joker remained this character who was very dark and very gritty, but was so captivating at the same time. When you were reading Joker stories, you couldn't help but laugh. You couldn't help but laugh at this kind of schemes he had. You couldn't help but laugh at the back and forth banter between Batman and himself. He was just that captivating. Now, what we found going forward was that in 1992, that DC had basically rolled this version of the Joker over into Batman the Animated Series. Again, we had kind of talked about this earlier, but this is basically a point whereby we see the non-murderous version of the Joker, but all other elements of the Joker being put into this character. We see that this Joker is hilarious in a lot of different ways, and even now, if I go back and watch any of the videos of the Joker from Batman the Animated Series and I hear him laugh, I'll laugh. Because to me, it's just hilarious. It's just always funny to hear that thing. And again, this is how the Joker exists. This is how he functions going forward. But the problem that we saw was that eventually the Joker's continuity began to go away. The Joker had effectively just kind of vanished from DC Comics and would actually come back during Scott Snyder's run of Batman in the New 52 with Endgame. But we're not going to get too far into that. The reason being is because once we start Batman Endgame, then we're going to get more into that. Then we're actually going to get into the story of how the Joker had vanished from DC Comics and why he returned during the New 52. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cut this video here. The reason being because when we talk about characters like the Red Hood, we've talked about that kind of stuff. And so I kind of feel like we'd basically be rehashing things that we've already discussed. And at this point, it's not really something that I'm wanting to do. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I think it was a pretty good discussion on the Joker given the in-depth continuity. And so what I'll do is down in the comments section, I'll post what I consider to be some of the more prominent stories of the Joker, what I consider to be some of the best stories of the Joker, and why it is he seems to be such a significant character in DC Comics. With that being said, I will catch you guys later. Peace.